Now we're going to test our Flyweight object, the student class object, and going to put together a test program called Test Flyweight. And in that program, we're going to store the information for 3 students. They're in a names array called with Ralph, Alice, and Sam, and an IDs array with the IDs of those 3 students, and a scores array with the scores of those 3 students on a test. And so now you have configuration information for 3 students. And now we're going to calculate the average score. As you recall, we're going to pass the average score of the test scores to the student constructor, and we calculate the average test score like this. And there is the average score. So now we have the average score. We have the configuration information necessary for each student up here. The average score on the exam there. So now we can create a student Flyweight object like this. We're going to create a student object, just named student, and pass the constructor the average score. So now we've created a single student object, as you see. And now we're going to be able to loop over all the students in our configuration data. Using the same student object, we're just going to configure them like this. Set name, set ID, set score. That will then configure the student object for use with the rest of the code. And in this case, we're just going to print the student name, their standing. So that's the idea. You have configuration information. You only need one Flyweight object. You configure it, that Flyweight object, on the fly. In this case, we're doing that in a loop. As we're looping over all the students, we're configuring it with the name from the names array and the ID from the IDs array, and the student score, test score from the scores array, and then we're going to print out their name and their standing. Then we're going to go to the next iteration of the loop, and still using the same student object, we're going to configure it for the next student, and then display the information of that student on the screen. And you're going to be able to see how, using one student object, we were able to handle 3 students. So all you have to do is instantiate one object, not 3 different objects for 3 different students. You configure this object on the fly, and then in this case we're printing out the information from each of those configured students in the single student object. So that's how the Flyweight design pattern works. You need to have one or a small number of configurable objects which you configure on the fly and then work with the rest of your code, avoiding heavy use of resources. As in when you have to create 3 or 4 or 1,000 different heavyweight objects. In this case, you only create one object or a small number of objects, configure on the fly, and then use that object in your code. So very handy. That's the Flyweight design pattern. We'll check it out, how this works. Now we're going to run this test Flyweight program, as you see, and it should loop over all the students and give us their relative standings as a percentile with regards to the mean, as you see here. So Ralph is going to have a standing of minus 18%, Alice 0%, and Sam plus 18%. So there you have it. We're able to work with 3 different students with one student object that we configured on the fly, rather than having to create 3 different objects, which is a pain if you have to create 1,000 different objects, for example. So that's the Flyweight design pattern.